Hello and welcome to the Pan-Africanist, Amani Africa's podcast on multilateral policy processes of concern and interest for Africa and on the African Union. In this edition of the Pan-Africanist, I will be sitting down and discussing on current affairs relating to the African Union and its work on peace and security issues with the African Union Commissioner for Political Affairs, Peace and Security, Ambassador Bankole Adeoye. As this is being recorded just before the convening of the next African Union Summit next month in February 2025, during which the elections for the African Union Commission leadership will be held, I will have a discussion with Ambassador Bankole Adeoye about his plans for re-election for the current position that he holds. Our conversation in this edition will also cover about the state of peace and security in Africa. It is coming against the background of various developments on the continent relating to peace and security. We have seen increase in the number of conflicts. We have also witnessed various critical developments relating to the geopolitics of the continent. Finally, we will also be discussing about the current state of African Union's role in the promotion of peace and security on the African continent and its interface and interaction with key actors in the realm of peace and security.
We have, in the course of last year, covered the preparations for the elections of the African Union Commission leadership scheduled to take place in February 2025 during the African Union Summit. We had conversations in that respect with two of the candidates for the position of chairperson. You are one of the candidates for the election that is taking place during the upcoming African Union Summit in February. You are standing for the position you are currently holding, that of Commissioner for Political Affairs, Peace and Security. Would I be wrong if I assume that you have an election program? If so, can you explain what your vision is for getting re-elected to the position you currently hold?
No, thank you so much, Amani Africa. First, let me wish you in particular and your staff a very happy, prosperous, and most importantly, peaceful 2025. All to the distinguished member states of the African Union, as well as all Africans as we strive for everlasting peace on our continent. Peace is very critical to every endeavor in humankind, and it's therefore important that we hope and pray that 2025 brings us the joy, the peace, and most importantly, the development that we all crave for. And now straight to your question. Yes, on the authority of the federal government of Nigeria that has represented me for the position of African Union Commissioner for Political Affairs, Peace and Security, endorsed by the ECOWAS heads of state and government, I'm running for the position that I currently hold, as you stated. And the vision is very clear. It has a four-focused agenda: consolidation, innovation, coherence, and impact. This vision is about the peace continuum: conflict prevention, conflict management, and most importantly, conflict resolution. Given this cycle, the focus remains on building on the norms and the pillars, the principles, underlying principles that guide our union, which is uniquely absent in many other continents. So our continent, the African Union, is a pace setter in promoting Agenda 2063. So my vision for the re-election bid is anchored on Agenda 2063, a peaceful, a more democratic, more secure continent. That vision, of course, is oiled by the principles that guide democracy, constitutionalism, the rule of law, and social justice. Peace is a continuum, and it's also the energizer for sustainable development. So specifically, what will be my vision statement? This, having given you the points about consolidation, about innovation, about coherence, and about impact. How do we attain these four critical elements going forward from 2025? First is to rebuild, to renew the fundamental, the cheaper option of conflict prevention, but through fundamentally preventive diplomacy, mediation, and dialogue. That is why later on, as we'll be discussing some of the initiatives, the innovation that we put in place is to have the first ever Africa Day for Peace and Reconciliation. Many of our countries, Angola, South Africa, have experienced, Rwanda, have experienced in reconciliation. And reconciliation will establish and advance building, peace building, to the point where post-conflict reconstruction and development is stabilized. So stability through the renewal and the topmost priority, what we call PAP, the Priority Action Plan of my candidacy, is anchored on conflict prevention that will certainly be achieved through transformative mediation and dialogue at all strata of the society. The second aspect of my vision is more hardcore. It is to build an integrated capacity and the capabilities required by member states and regional economic communities, by stakeholders, to counter the threat of terrorism, violent extremism, and general insecurity. And this will be anchored, in my view, with what our leaders already established in Malabo, May 2022, at the Extraordinary Summit, the first Extraordinary Summit in 2 decades on terrorism and, of course, on constitutional changes of government. So how do we support member states? And this is where the African Standby Force comes as that changing game changer for necessary action. So we have to support member states, because today the challenges are no more simply the typical way of conflicts. There are new conflicts emerging. There are conflicts in the air. There are conflicts in our networks in terms of what you see with AI and new technologies. So we need to be able to support our member states in definitely building the requisite capacities and capabilities. We have to do that more, but we need the resources, but we also have the internal and institutional challenges to overcome. This, I can assure you, will be the second priority in my second tenure, God willing. The third is anchored on African solutions to African problems, but through democracy, deepening democracy. In Malabo, in May 2022, our leaders agreed on 3 action points. Robust response, which is the number 2 priority I've given you, which is to build the capacities of states. Deepening democracy, which is now the 3rd priority I'm telling you about democracy, making sure that constitutionalism, the rule of law, democracy continue to thrive on our continent, and most importantly, sustainable collective security. And you can see the coherence I'm building, as I said, in the first aspect. So, using democracy as a spring to help promote inclusivity, to promote the role of women and the youth in their governance processes. Here we speak about effective governance and peace dividends. Democracy is that factor that will help shape that. And the African Union is already committed. There is no intergovernmental diplomatic body in the world that suspends member states internationally for going foul of democracy. Only the African Union. The UN does not do it. So we must continue on this trajectory without losing focus on our principles, given that the deep knowledge is necessary to achieve that. Priority 4 is simply smart and inclusive partnerships. The enormity of the challenges we have cannot be addressed by the African Union alone, cannot be addressed by the African Union Commission alone, cannot be addressed by regional economic communities or mechanisms alone. It is a collective effort, and that is why our common defense and security, African defense and security policy framework needs to be imbibed by all of us as we work with civil society, we work with academia, we work with labor unions, we work with the youth, we work with the women. This is all I'm saying about smart partnerships. So smart, inclusive partnership is this 4th agenda that is a priority for us. But that agenda is only realizable on the condition that we also see that smart in the context of specific, measurable, achievable, reliable, and time-bound in the classic strategic thinking. Finally, any of these 4 top priorities will not be achievable without the requisite organizational, institutional capacities. And this is where the institutional reform, the capacity in-house, in the department, working with the RECs, working with the various think tanks across our continent, including yours, will come to fore. So we have these 5 priority areas that will make us have a change in our peace landscape on the continent.
You mentioned very critical issues. I think one of the areas in respect of which during your term that we should comment and indeed acknowledge as a community is the 4th priority area that you mentioned about smart partnerships. And it did during this ending tenure of yours that you established the network of think tanks for peace, the Pan-PAPs, the civil society organizations facing political affairs, peace and security of the African Union, recognizing and understanding that all hands on deck is what is required in order to achieve peace and security. So wherever capacities exist, we have to harness those capacities in order to advance the cause of peace and security. And therefore, there is something that we have already done that can be built on in terms of taking that forward. Now, with respect to
democracy, which is one of the areas of work that you made reference to. One of the questions relates to what is your assessment of, for example, how the African Union Commission, particularly your portfolio, needs to do better, needs to change from the last 4 years in terms of these 4 or 5 priority areas. If you would like to see change happening from the past 4 years of your experience, what would it that you would say, okay, this one and these are the areas that I would like to do differently? For example, in terms of holding member states accountable to the commitments that they have made, not to new standards, as you said. There are commitments that they have made under the African Union norms, and in terms of enforcing those norms on the part of member states as part of conflict prevention and as part of enhancing democratization and democratic governance.
First, the African Union structure, the system, is multi-actor in nature. It's not just the Commission. As you know, the front actors remain the member states, the regional communities, and of course, stakeholders. And in broadening that scope, yes, you are right, we established the network of think tanks for peace. We also established on the aspect of learning from each other, because you said what lessons. The most important thing that we need to do better on the continent is to learn, because from our own successes that we have seen, whether it's the Pretoria Agreement that is working, that the guns are virtually silent in the Tigray region, or addressing the current crisis in the Sahel or Sudan. So lesson learning and generating knowledge. This is one area where we have done very well. We have started processes of documenting the best lessons, comparative lessons from our elections. We saw progress of the resilience of democratic institutions in Senegal. We saw transition smooth in Ghana, in Botswana, in Mauritius, and we can go on. There is an abundance of experience to be shared. That is one thing that we must take forward to the next tenure. And knowing fully well that democracy itself is not just about elections. It's that continuum I spoke about. It is about the consolidation I spoke about. It is about the innovation we have to be promoting. So what are we doing? Not just observing elections at the operational level, but assisting member states, assisting actors to be better trained in election monitoring, in working with actors, and democratizing the space, most importantly, for election observers. Now, the record in 2024 will show that we have over 65% of AU election observers as female for the first time in our history. So we cannot, as Commission, be speaking to greater role for women and youth in national democratic spaces, and we, as the AU, will go with observers that are not reflecting our ambition. 2025 is the year that the Assembly gave us the mandate to have gender parity and 35% youth inclusion in all our staff processes in the AU. Of course, we've not been able to achieve that. But for us in PAPS, we are already striving harder to reach that goal. And that is why democracy is important for us. For us, democracy is not a one-day event. It's a long haul. But in that long haul, what do we see? In 2025, we're going to prioritize the role of the media, not just as coverage processes for elections, for democracy, but as integral stakeholders. The same for the youth and the same for the women. We are going to bring in professionals to be looking at how we can improve our democracy. We are going to learn lessons and implement the outcomes of Accra 1 and Accra 2, which were strategic reflections on countering unconstitutional changes of government. The constitutionality issues or constitutionalism issues on our continent remain very, very critical. And we can learn. And this is why we set up what is called IREC, the African Union Inter-Regional Knowledge Exchange on conflict prevention and early warning. We must not forget that it takes two to tango. And this is why we have to work with all the stakeholders in making sure that we have a better, peaceful, and most importantly, prosperous continent.
If we come to the state of peace and security on the continent, it would be good if you can reflect back on the past 4 years of your role as Commissioner for Political Affairs, Peace and Security. What is your assessment of the trajectory and the past 4 years trends of the state of peace and security on the continent? Do you think that, where do we stand from the past 4 years, and what is your assessment of where we are and where we are heading?
First, our tools remain most relevant, from the Constitutive Act to Agenda 2063 to silencing the guns by 2030, 5 years ago, and to the second decade for the implementation of Agenda 2063 itself. So we are still on track in terms of our policy frameworks. However, the threats of today are not the threats of 2020. Yes, post-COVID-19 atmosphere, the landscape changed our thinking, changed the way we interact, changed the crisis we also face. But technology, AI in particular, will be a defining factor in the peace we see. But what are the threats that we see today that may be different 4 years ago? And you know them, certainly. Number one is the geopolitical competition that we see, the huge scramble for African resources, and then the lack of that collective international solidarity. The African solidarity is inherent, but we see rather external interference exploding while terrorism is exponentially in every region of our continent. This has never happened before. And then, of course, unprecedented 6 member states, Gabon, Sudan, Guinea, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, have been suspended from the African Union. Some of them will become the longest ever countries with suspension, because we are yet to see good progress towards the restoration of constitutional order, apart from Gabon, that has held referendum on the new election, and the dates are on. The others that have held referendum on elections like Mali, we do not see so far good sign for, the recent changes in the cabinet in Mali, given what the former prime minister had requested for in terms of progress towards. Now, these are now internal stakeholders requesting for democracy. Democracy must be our guard. It is not about being given any interest, but rather looking at how we build inclusivity in our societies for the goals of sustainable development, the goals of Agenda 2063 to thrive. And so for us, going back to your question, is we see the need to address the challenges in our 5 regions. And let me go through that horizon scanning briefly. West Africa, with the threats of unconstitutional changes of government. Thank God in 2024, we did not witness any additional military incursion into the political arena. But it's not a sign that the democratic regression has been halted. We must see democracy in a step-by-step accommodation of all voices and for the benefits of democracy, the dividends of democracy. So, West Africa, we still have issues in the Sahel, which we must confront frontally. Together, we need to address, because as you know, the Sahel has become the epicenter of terrorism globally. North Africa, we still have the issue of Libya to be resolved. We are working closely. In October, the chairperson of the Commission, the chairperson of the Union were both in Tripoli to engage on the national reconciliation process, which the AU is charged with. And I can assure you that in 2025, with the support of the stakeholders, we may get this more on board, and we could see elections being held for Libya to go back to stability. East Africa is more complex, the Horn of Africa in particular. And you can see from 2024, from 2020 to 2020 to now, we have a good story in the Tigray process, where peace has been largely returned to the troubled region of Tigray. We are now in the process of implementing every facet of the Pretoria Agreement. So we really want to thank the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, the government of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, and the TPLF for making peace happen. But we have to consolidate that peace, working through the monitoring and verification compliance mission, which the AU is spearheading with the support of partners, and we are pleased that that will be renewed as we speak for another 6 months. So the African Union is doing its best, but the challenges are enormous. Of course, Somalia remains one area where the AU and the international community must work together to operationalize the African Union support and stabilization mission. Awesome. Awesome will be a landmark in the transition from AMISOM to ATMIS, given that this is about support and stabilization. Stabilization and recovery form part of our newly revised post-conflict reconstruction and development policy framework that was adopted at the last summit by our heads of state. So we see Somalia as very, very critical to the stability of the region. We cannot be held ransom by Al-Shabaab. We have been fighting with modest successes in the past 17, 18 years. But the African Union will never abandon Somalia. And this is the critical factor given the new UN Security Council Resolution 2767. So by and large, East Africa remains very critical. But I must say, in all these regions, what we see that is exacerbating conflict, that is a threat multiplier, is climate change. So we should not see some cross-cutting themes as just academic. They are real in terms of what the impact of climate change does on peace and security. And I'm very pleased that in
my first tenure, we prioritized this to the point where we are now at the level of a common African position, the first by any continental body in the world to pull out the impact of what we call climate security, but the impact of climate change on peace and security. Of course, Southern Africa, Mozambique is still in a two-way crisis, which we are engaging the authorities and SADC to find a common solution. Collective security must work to stop the political violence as a result of post-election conflict. Second, we have to face and not lose focus in fighting the new Al-Shabaab in Cabo Delgado. We really want to thank the government of the Republic of Rwanda and Mozambique for doing that fight together with the AU providing support. One factor that we have also seen in the use of all the AU instruments is the Peace Fund. Resources, knowledge, material, financial for peace is very, very critical. And I really want to thank the chairperson of the commission for leading the process of operationalization of the Peace Fund during our first term, my own first term in 2023. And now the Peace Fund, through its major windows, the program budget and the crisis reserve facility have been working in tandem for our priorities to make sure that peace happens. So basically, what you see, and of course, Central Africa is also is one area where we need to consolidate peace. In Central African Republic itself, in Eastern DRC, ensuring that we do not return to the days of member states in conflict. We are basically dealing with non-state armed groups in fighting terrorism, in fighting insurrection, in fighting rebellion. That must remain our focus. So we really want to assure you that we will reinvest in the Luanda process and the Nairobi process to make sure that the AU and all actors continue to support the leadership of the president of Angola in making sure that we have peace in Eastern DRC and the rest, of course, of the region, Central Africa.
So you clearly painted a picture of growing insecurity in terms of the spread of terrorism.
It's a mixed grill. Yes, there's exponential growth in terrorism, but there's also the common robust response that is building through member states' solidarity. What is missing is that we do not have the resources enough to do that together. But we are not relenting on the use of 2719 as the UN Security Council resolution on financing AU peace support operations. We are not relenting on the full operationalization of the African Standby Force. We will not relent in African solutions to African problems. We will not relent until we see peace on our continent.
So one of the issues that relates to the priorities that you have painted at the start of our conversation relates to prioritizing conflict prevention, preventive diplomacy. You explained some of the challenges, including, for example, the geopolitical dimension, the change in geopolitical dimension, lack of international solidarity because of the rivalry between different powers, and the increase in interference, and that is making the resolution of conflicts more difficult at this point in time. Do you think that for the African Union to deliver on these essential objectives of democratization, of halting the regression of democratization, halting the recurrence of unconstitutional change of government,
of promoting peace and security, do you think that member states are engaging and also mobilizing the level of consensus that is required in order to deliver on those collective actions? If you look at, for example, the Horn of Africa, where we have witnessed interstate tensions emerging, in the Great Lakes region, where we have the risk of interstate war. We have seen a regional order fragmenting in the Sahel. So these signs seem to suggest that we are not witnessing at the level of consensus, the level of African countries coming together in order to deal with this continental challenge that the continent is facing.
We are witnessing a shift globally in power dynamics. We are returning to put it lightly, to the days of the Cold War. Hot war, they say these days. Internally on our continent, our youth have become restive. Women are demanding more say in governance. Opposition parties, in some cases, have won through the ballot box. But the challenges remain for us to find innovative means to make impact. Meaning that, in my view, our member states must be enmeshed in Pan-Africanism to, first of all, drive and inspire solidarity. And this is why some member states are bilaterally supporting the fight against terrorism. This is why we have made enormous progress, almost 95%, to the conclusion of the agreement to kickstart the African Standby Force. We are making efforts to roll out our vision, which we emphasized in the new Agenda for Peace of the UN and the Pact for the Future of the UN. So globally, continentally, at national level, at regional level, we have the ingredients that can promote that solidarity to defeat and eliminate the challenges we face. I am very optimistic that this is doable because we saw the sign in the Tigray resolution of the conflict. It was African-owned, African Union-led mediation process. Of course, with the support of IGAD, with the support of the United States, and with the support of the United Nations. That is a model. The MNJTF, a solidarity initiative comprising Nigeria, Niger, Cameroon, Chad, voluntarily with the Benin Republic, have been able to degrade Boko Haram and ISWAP, even though they are still very active. But it's a model of peace enforcement, which is one of the few new responses we are pushing for in the way to go. We have a doctrine in the department that must be anchored on African solutions to African problems, not to the exclusion of partners, but friendly actors in the international system must continue to realize that today's Africa is not the Africa of the 1960s. This is a new Africa. Our youth are more educated, more vibrant,
more committed to also using the instruments of new technology to make impact globally. We must transform that also into peacemaking, into peace building, and into peace consolidation. So I'm very optimistic that we can make it happen, and that the challenges, yet though enormous, but they're not insurmountable. This is why we need the solidarity of member states. We must not forget that we also have a system of regional economic communities and mechanisms that have continuously become the front runners, the first responders to crisis. The African Union is ready to support them. I can assure you that we were the first to support the East African Community Regional Force that was deployed to Eastern DRC. We are also now supporting the SADC mission to DRC, like we supported in Mozambique. So we are really living in a different world because we have the instrument of a $400 million peace fund. Yes, it's still a relatively little amount compared to what we need in the peace enforcement domain. But I can assure you that we are now better placed to support our member states who are already in solidarity. Solidarity brought them together in MNJTF. Solidarity brought our member states together, SADC, in Mozambique, now in Eastern DRC. Solidarity brought Rwanda to keep on supporting Mozambique in the fight against Al-Shabaab in Cabo Delgado. Solidarity can make things happen, but it must be anchored on the necessary ingredients of resources. It must be anchored on knowledge. It must be anchored on lessons learned. And this is why we're now documenting better the reports of the Peace and Security Council. The Peace and Security Council has remained that formidable organ which we have worked with. I can claim it better than any time in the past, that now this department working, servicing, supporting the initiatives of the Peace and Security Council. We have to continuously do that to the point where they give us the directives and the direction for change on our continent.
One of the areas where we have experienced it in terms of, for example, the reflections, the 20 years reflections, just we are on the last areas. During the reflections of the 20 years anniversary of the PSC, the question of implementation of decisions popped up as one area that the PSC struggled with. I wonder if there is a strategy moving forward in order to address the challenge of implementation. I think it would be great if you have reflections on that. I have two more questions, Ambassador, with your kind permission, and then we will conclude.
The Peace and Security Council remains this standing organ for peace and security on our continent, with enormous powers. And you recall in 2024 was a landmark year for the commemoration of the 20th anniversary of the Peace and Security Council. Its decisions are final, except at the level of the AU Assembly of Heads of State and Government. And in 20 years, there have never been any reversal of the actions or the conclusions of the Peace and Security Council, except in one occasion. So it is very clear that the solidarity we are speaking for also is represented, symbolized in the Peace and Security Council. 15 members of the Peace and Security Council, based on regional equation, remains our hope and our pillar for finding African solutions to African problems. And I'm very pleased that I'm associated with that council. In terms of your question relating to implementation of decisions, it is a collective act. And you have implications for resources, for capacities at the Commission, for regional economic communities. And I'm very sure in 2025, the Council, as you said, deliberated on how to enhance and accelerate the implementation. But I can assure you that many of the decisions of Council have been implemented where the relevant actors remain active. For example, for every response to unconstitutional change of government, the Council will call for the restoration of constitutional democratic order. That has not been able to happen in the last 4 years, given the posture of many of the countries involved. But with regular, persistent diplomatic pressure and conversation and dialogue. Last year, the Peace and Security Council in 2022 and 2023 met informally with foreign ministers of the then 5 countries. Today, as of mid-November and December 2024, I also engage with them. So the conversation is going on. Soft power, pressure, the reality of democracy and the need for a united African Union, a united ECOWAS, a united SADC, a united East African Community, a united IGAD is dawning on us because it is fundamental for the implementation, for example, of the decisions of the Standing Organ on Peace and Security.
So this has to do with the idea that, yes, AU has been supporting initiatives by SADC, initiative by the East African Community, but it was not itself present and leading on peace and security initiatives in Eastern DRC, peace and security initiative in Mozambique, and in some of the other spaces as well. Its role and influence has been limited. And there are those who say that as a result of that, AU is conceding a lot of diplomatic space to outside actors. And they give examples of, for example, the role of Turkey in mediating between Ethiopia and Somalia, in respect of which the Peace and Security Council in October actually requested the good office of the chairperson. And also in Sudan, the ceasefire was basically negotiated and being led by the US and Saudi, not by African actors, not IGAD, for example. So is the AU facing competition in terms of the diplomatic role that it plays from outside actors? And how does the AU plan to reestablish that leadership role in diplomacy?
Let me remind you that the African Union operates with various actors based on the principles of complementarity and comparative advantage. I had earlier said the first responders are the regional economic communities. And if the regional economic communities are the first responders, and they are all part of our union, our glorious union, there is constant engagement, constant dialogue between the AU and the regional economic communities. As you know very well, all the regional economic decisions, MNJTF, the then G5 Sahel Joint Force, the SADC mission in Mozambique and Eastern DRC, were all endorsed and constantly renewed by the Peace and Security Council. So we are not absent from the engagement in either deploying peace support operations or engaging in negotiations for peace talks, as whether it's the good example, the Pretoria process for Tigray was successful with the support of the regional body, and in other cases, we remain fully involved. The African Union actually convened the quadripartite summit, bringing all actors together of the Peace, Security, and Cooperation Framework Agreement for Eastern DRC that was virtually in effect for a decade. All the countries that were involved, including the regional economic communities, including the International Conference on the Great Lakes region, as well as ECAS, new one, brought on board, EAC, we were all in the coordination frame for peace in the Eastern DRC. So it is not factual that the AU is being left behind. Rather, the regional economic communities, as you know, they are also called the building blocks for economic integration. Now, we are speaking about regional political integration, peace efforts being made in collaboration with them. On my first day in office, March 15, 2021, I made a phone call to all the available heads of regional integration because we are twins in the search for peace. We cannot be inseparable. We have to work together jointly, commonly, based on the grand vision of the African renewal, African transformation, a new Africa. And in doing so, I can assure you that we hope that we will continue that with a renewed mandate, strongly, stronger, without any choking of the regional space. Because the regions, the 5 regions, the 10 recognized AU regional economic communities and mechanisms are to help us in better governance and, of course, the achievement for peace and stability. I want to assure you that I'm a firm believer of the concept of regional, political, and economic integration. That is why we set up the African Union Interregional Knowledge Exchange on early warning and conflict prevention, because the early warning is more visible at the grassroots, at the regional level, where they are closer to the issues. From Addis Ababa, we cannot do it alone. And that is why even the UN Charter recognizes regional integrations. So in our own Constitutive Act, we also recognize the place of regional economic communities. Now that we have the mid-year coordination meeting process, we have elevated that to the point where we also engage the RECs on the way forward. We've discussed the issues about silencing the guns together. We have discussed the issues of operationalizing. And as I speak, we are jointly drafting a strategy to mobilize resources together. So even if it's a SADC mission in Eastern DRC, even if it's an ECOWAS mission in Guinea-Bissau or in the Gambia stabilization mission, even if it's an African Union-led mission also in Somalia, we will jointly mobilize resources. We will jointly mobilize the military, civilian, and police contingents for greater stability and for peace on our continent. I thank you so much for having me.
Ambassador Bankole Adeoye, Commissioner for Political Affairs, Peace and Security, thank you very much for joining the Pan-Africanist, Amani Africa's podcast. And we wish you all the best as you campaign for re-election for the position that you currently hold. Thank you all very much for joining us and for listening to this episode of The Pan-Africanist.